So I guess we all sometimes lie awake at night worrying about actually the state of the world and the crisis that we're in. And I think for those of us in Melbourne, we sort of thought we personally had got through it, and suddenly realising that it goes on. And certainly what's happening internationally shows us the scale of what we're facing. And I don't need to, remind anyone about the serious consequences both of the health crisis, the lockdown, and the disruption that this is causing to the immediate health crisis, and the knock-on effects for socially, economically, and environmentally as things are put in place that are not the best. So just as the crisis, I think, has shown the cracks and the strengths in our world, so it has with evaluation, that I think a lot of the problems we've had in evaluation for years, that it's seen as largely irrelevant, largely extractive, too much, too little, too late, or too much, focused on just reporting and compliance and not actually on improvement. All of those problems are brought to sharp focus, but also a lot of the strengths in our work that we can draw on. I'm just going to put on my timer because so I can keep track of my time, which was my key starting point. All right. So looking at all of these issues, at a better evaluation, we're really, very keen to say, how can we support all of us learning how to do this stuff better? And we are doing a series looking at that in terms of a number of aspects, but thinking about it generally, it, for me, came down to a particular thing. This is the summary. This is my takeaway message. Everything else is detail. We actually have to seriously address complexity. And not just as some fluffy academic term and some esoteric interest, and not just saying, oh, it's all very difficult, but seriously saying, what do we mean by complexity? That is operating under conditions of ongoing uncertainty and unpredictability, which doesn't mean that we sit on our hands and say it's all too hard, but that we have to find seriously different ways of thinking about the way the world works, thinking about how interventions seek to change things, and how we can build and share and use knowledge to help us do that better. So this is not a new concept, all right? And I sort of went back. We've been going on about this now for 20 years, looking at complexity and evaluation. And yet just this past week, I was asked to review 2 serious documents in evaluation, looking at the state of evaluation, that didn't mention this at all, didn't address any of these issues. And I was just really pretty disappointed, having spent a lot of that time trying to say this stuff's important. Obviously, it has not reached where it needs to reach, for not even to be on the agenda. And I think this has always been of relevance to a lot of interventions and to a lot of evaluation, but now in this current situation, it's relevant to all of us in terms of that. So I just want to say a few things about, the distinctions that I've found helpful as a starting point if this is new to you, and then some specific implications for evaluation. So there's lots of ways of looking at this, obviously, but one that's a good starting point is to distinguish between what's simple, complicated, complex. And so this is what I've done here. So, a lot of evaluation proceeds as if everything we do in every way is simple, meaning it's discrete, it's standardised, it works pretty much the same everywhere. And so evaluation is just saying, are we doing it right? Is it compliance? And what works? Because there's a single way to do it. We can talk about best practices. When we do an evaluation, we just need knowledge transfer. We pick up the recommendations and we do it. We synthesise the reports and we do what works. And it's like having Google directions, where you get very specific directions of, go this way, turn left, turn right, with no skill needed. Now, that's never been true for all interventions, and it's never been really helpful for all evaluation to go this way, but it's increasingly inappropriate. So the complicated is saying, well, things work differently in different situations, and so your question needs to be what works for whom in what contexts. Your recommendations need to be contingent. This will work in urban areas but not rural areas because of this. And the uptake of evidence and evaluation findings needs to be about translation. How do we adapt it to suit this new situation? So it's a bit more like a transport map and a timetable, where at different times of the day or night there's better or worse ways to do it. Sometimes the train or the bus or walking or bicycle is going to be better. So that's an improvement, but it's still sort of saying, well, if you just get more information and disaggregate it and line it all up, you'll get the answer. And so there won't be a single answer, but there'll be a series of answers, and then you'll just pick the right answer for your situation. And complexity is more than this. So complex is when the interventions are non-standardised and they're changing and they're adaptive and they're emergent. And so we need to support interventions where it's unclear what the issues are, it's unclear what's going to work, and even when we find out what works, that generalisation will rapidly decay because it will work in a particular context and the context is changing rapidly. And so your questions need to be about what is working and how do we understand this? And your recommendations have to be dynamic and emergent and perhaps around principles. And the evaluation uptake is not about evaluators build the knowledge and they tell people what to do, but how do we work together to have ongoing knowledge generation? And it's more like having a map and a compass that you work it out as you go along. So what does that mean for evaluation? So thinking about this, I've gone back to the rainbow framework in better evaluation that, you know, looks at the tasks involved in doing an evaluation or thinking about the evaluation function. I just want to name a couple of those, and then some of our other panelists are picking up. So the first one is around theories of change. You know, theories of change are not a linear log frame. They're not a set of inputs and outputs. That's just, again, not really helpful. In this condition, we need theories of change that have explicit change theories about how we think change occurs. And again, that's not about levers and you know, simple acting on people, but working with them around. Someone's just got something very. I'm just getting a lot.
Just looking to find the mute all except Patricia button. Oh no, I think someone's found their own. There you go.
Thank you very much. It did just make me think. I was trying to have a visual about the emergent change, and it did sound like something bubbling up. And I think that's how do we you know, accentuate things and dampen things down rather than actually pull levers. So really different types of change theories in our interventions, and that are also adaptive and addressing emergent change. So we really need very different theories of change from the linear input-output models. We need our framing of our evaluations is not about asking questions, what works, but how do you inform adaptive action, and very much focused on not just meeting the needs of centralised policymakers, but really supporting local implementers, and that's going to include perhaps community members and local staff as well, to change the way they do things and be using this theory of change to help make sense of all sorts of information. So it's not we do the theory of change and we collect the data, but we collect the data and go, hang on, we've got to rethink our theory of change. When you're collecting data, there's obviously, we'll hear more this session about how do we collect data despite the restrictions and dangers of the pandemic, and there's a lot of practical things around that. And what does that mean for particularly making sure we don't miss out the hard to access people, the people who don't have mobile technology, and making sure we address, you know, equity in terms of whose voices are being heard. Around the causal questions, I think we've got to get really serious about non-experimental causal inference that doesn't assume a stable situation, and that can use really diverse data, and that can use emergent iterative cycles of analysing and collecting data to draw these inferences. And if, you know, again, there's a number of ways of doing this that should be on the repertoire and you know, need to be named and understood. The synthesis is an area where I think some of the cracks of evaluation have been quite evident, because a number of organisations have tried doing some rapid syntheses of existing evaluations to guide use in similar types of interventions. And I think it's shown that we've often had real problems both in the types of conclusions that are drawn and therefore our ability to synthesise them in useful ways. And I was, on the other hand, really struck by Patricia Greenhouse's synthesis of the evidence around why we should be wearing masks. And if you haven't read her reply to the critique of that, it's just a really compelling example of how you do stuff that's timely, valid, thoughtful, and draws on eclectic data. Reporting and supporting use. Again, we've often focused so much on the evaluation report and how do we have really timely, targeted knowledge products from a range of people, a range of local implementers, making things simple without being simplistic. And how do we support people to translate findings to what that means for new contexts? So in all of that sort of stuff, which is much less about we set up a plan at the start and we implement it and someone from outside comes in, implements it and rolls it out. I think it's therefore got implications for manage, that we have to partner and support a local control and conduct of evaluation. We need to do more rapid turnaround evaluations. And we're going to need an emergent M&E plan that's going to adapt as new needs come up. So that's the sort of the task force. We're continuing to explore these issues. On our site, we've got a statement around that, and we're running a series and developing a thematic page around that, and also sharing stuff really quickly on Twitter. So I'm really keen to hear from the other panelists, to hear from everyone else, and to continue this conversation. So I'll stop sharing now and hand back to our chair.